Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the second in a series of book talks hosted by ASWAD, the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. My name is Lori Lambert, the Secretary for ASWAD, and today we are excited to host Professors Percy Hintzen, Charisse Burden-Stelly, and Kamugisha for a discussion of their new book, Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Postcolonial State. And this is the book. If you don't have it, please get it. It's wonderful. I'm going to introduce our discussants, and the co-editors of the volume, Professor Burden-Stelly and Professor Kamugisha, and they will introduce Professor Hintzen. But first, a few announcements. The CFP for ASWAD's 11th Biennial Conference and convening of the International Congress of African and African Diaspora Studies is now live. The conference will be hosted at the University of Ghana, Legon, from August 2nd to August 5th, 2023, and the theme is Repatriating African Studies. Review of submissions will begin March 1st, 2023, and all submissions are due by March 15th, 2023. So your membership must be current to access the conference site, and I will drop ASWAD's website in the chat so that you can all access that information there. ASWAD's programming is made possible through the support of our members. If you're already a member, we thank you. If you've yet to join, we encourage you to sign up at aswaddiaspora.org. At our site, you can also donate to support other initiatives, including our efforts to provide free membership to Global South members, as well as conference travel grants for Global South members attending our conference. So please check that out. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Professors Burden-Stelly and Professor Kamugisha. So Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly is an Associate Professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University, a scholar of critical Black studies, political theory, political economy, and intellectual history. She is the co-author of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History, the co-editor of Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writings, and the co-editor of the volume we're discussing today, Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Postcolonial State. Burden-Stelly's single-authored book, Black Scare, Red Scare, will be published with the University of Chicago Press later on this year. Her scholarship appears in peer-reviewed journals, including Small Axe, Souls, Du Bois Review, Socialism and Democracy, International Journal of Africana Studies, and the CLR James Journal, and in popular publications, including Monthly Review, Boston Review, and Essence Magazine. Also The Nation, Black Perspectives, and very importantly, Black Agenda Report. She's a member of the Black Alliance for Peace's Research and Political Education team. So welcome, Professor Charisse Burden-Stelly. Kamugisha is the Ruth Simmons Professor of Africana Studies at Smith College. He is the editor of 11 books and special issues of journals on Caribbean and Africana thought, and the author of Beyond Coloniality, Citizenship and Freedom in the Caribbean Intellectual Tradition. Thank you both for being our discussants today, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Lori. Thank you to ASWAD, and I'm so thrilled to be here to speak about reproducing domination with the amazing Aaron and Percy, and I just want to also thank them for bringing me onto this project, which means a lot to me given the ways that Percy has influenced my own work. And so for the opening remarks, by way of introduction, we actually had a piece that appeared today in Starbroke, I think that's how you pronounce it, newspaper in Guyana that's about Percy and about the volume. So it was just very fortuitous that these things dropped on the same day. So I'm just gonna read a little bit from that piece, and I hope you all will check it out. So for more than 40 years, Dr. Percy C. Hintzen has provided some of the most significant and enduring analysis of the colonial and post-colonial realities of the Caribbean. He has published books, articles, and public scholarship invaluable to understanding how Western imperialism, underdevelopment, neocolonialism, and elite domination have fundamentally shaped the political economy and social relations of the Anglophone Caribbean generally, in Guyana, Trinidad, and Barbados particularly. This corpus engages a broad range of issues, from structural adjustment to Creole capture of the state apparatus to capitalist globalization to the politics of identity. This is not to mention Hintzen's invaluable contributions to African diaspora studies through his study of inter alia, the discourse, policy, and practice of economic development, the intersections of modernity, nationalism, and citizenship, and West Indian identity formation in the West. With the extensive body of work, we are able to see and able to understand the manifold ways that Caribbean subjects and subjectivities have been at the center of the material and cultural realities of the modern world. Another of Percy's contributions is mentoring a cadre of students whose scholarship on subjects including racial capitalism, such as my own, coloniality, Black sexuality and ballroom culture, and migration and transnationalism has shaped several fields of study precisely because of his mentorship and influence. Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Postcolonial State encapsulate Hintzen's range, rigor, and continued relevance, and the mutual respect and intellectual feedback loop between himself and his students. And so this is really important. It's really important that both myself and Aaron are students and mentees of Percy, and that we worked on this volume because it conveys the collaborative spirit and the ongoing, Percy's role as a sort of ongoing student and learner that takes the work of his students seriously, and how he incorporates it into his own already sort of fabulous corpus. So for me, I just want to talk a little bit about Percy as a scholar of racial capitalism. This is not a term he uses often in his work, but if you really read Percy's body of work, he's actually at the forefront of theorizing what we now call racial capitalism. His interventions include, his interventions, including several of the chapters collected in Reproducing Domination, not least our own co-authored essay, Culturalism, Development, and the Crisis of Socialist Transformation, have been foundational to understanding intersections of racial formation, economic exploitation, and the globalized nature of the state. Like my own work, the essays collected in this volume bring together the two dominant approaches to racial capitalism, each of which is relevant to the neo-colonial realities of the Caribbean post-colonial state. The first approach is that of Cedric Robinson, which people are most familiar with, that comes out of his 1983 book, Black Marxism, the Making of the Black Radical Tradition, but more significantly, the republication of that work with a new preface by the author and the foreword written by Robin Kelley. So for Robinson, racial capitalism describes how the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued racial direction as it is social ideology and political practice. He also talks about how, as a material force, it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. So for him, racial capitalism, in other words, is a continuation of the social, cultural, and political, as well as the ideological complexes of European feudalisms into the capitalist form, as well as its antagonisms. The second approach to racial capitalism, with which people are probably much less familiar, is that of the South African political economists and social activists who emerged from the context of anti-apartheid and liberation struggles in Southern Africa and the Black consciousness movement in the 1970s. As historian Peter James Hudson points out, this political economy approach is distinct from Robinson's political philosophical approach. And so it centers political economy as opposed to a sort of metaphysics or political philosophy. So the South African educator and political activist Neville Alexander summed up racial capitalism as the expression of capitalism in South Africa appended to foreign capital that produced racist ideology and political forms of racial discrimination against which mass liberation struggles have been waged. Its foundations were in capitalist mining interests at the turn of the 20th century, when racial differentiation was institutionalized within the South African working class on terms which perpetuated the profit rates of the mining industry. As the Union of South Africa came into being, the racial differentiation that constituted the mining industry became institutionalized as a policy of racial segregation. This segregation was the foundation of the apartheid system that arose in 1948, with the blessing of the United States, the World Bank, and other Western foreign investors. In effect, these entities reinscribed racial capitalism and the Bantustans that developed in the 1950s and 1960s through direct investment and loans. So, Hintzen's analysis brings together not only the political economy and political philosophy of racial capitalism, but also its culture and ideology and its social relations and epistemology. Scholars in disciplines from sociology to political science have tended to either leave the state by the wayside in their studies of trans-territorial and supranational regimes of governance, movements of peoples and goods and cultural circulation, or on the other hand, have remained entrapped in a nation-state framework that neglects internationalist, world systemic, and global realities of culture and political economy. By contrast, Percy's work on the Caribbean, not to mention Africa and Latin America, has consistently offered a methodology for expertly avoiding such pitfalls by centering racial capitalism. As he explained in the prologue of Reproducing Domination, he understands the state as constitutively global, given that, quote, the Westphalian form of national authority and sovereignty appears merely to be an instrumentality for the management of global flows for capitalist accumulation, end quote. He adds to this, quote, the state reveals itself to have always been a global imposition upon national territories, organizing inflows and outflows of people, finance, resources, technology, and information in keeping with the needs of capital, end quote. So it is my hope that with Reproducing Domination, Percy's work will not only stand alongside people like Walter Rodney and Cedric Robinson and others in terms of understanding racial capitalism, but also that his work will help bring the Caribbean more fully into this discourse, which up to now tends to be sort of marginal or neglected in these broader studies of racial capitalism. And so it's really important that we understand Percy not only as a theorist and analyst of racial capitalism, but also the way his uncanny ability to continue to put forth that the structures of domination that constitute the modern world, as well as the forms of contestation, really coalesce around the Caribbean, and the Caribbean remains such an important site to understanding modernity, and in this case, racial capitalism. So I will stop there and pass it on to Aaron.
Yes. So thank you very much to everyone for attending, and to Charisse for that tour de force of an introduction. I'm going to make just a few points before we get into our discussion conversation. You know, the first thought on my mind that was coming to me when let me see, towards the end of Charisse's presentation was, wow, Guyana, you know, and that particular generation from Guyana, Andai, Walter Rodney, Gordon Rollaire, Percy Hintzen, you know, an incredible generation of Caribbean scholars who've come up, whose work is of world renowned and increasingly is now understood to be at the center of Caribbean studies and of Black international studies. So a few things on Hintzen. Percy is the leading political sociologist in the Anglophone Caribbean. And for me, along with Jackie Alexander, the most profound critic of a consolidation of rule by the post-colonial elites in the post-independence Anglophone Caribbean. The particular retelling and the tale they tell of that consolidation of power has captivated me for 20 years. And I do talk about it and recount it in my book. But really what I want to do is from here is really just make 3 points about Percy's work before we go directly into the productive conversation that the three of us will have. And so these are 3 to me of the signal contributions that Percy has made, apart from the very important discussion that Charisse has given us about his contribution to racial capitalism. First, there's a question of how he recounts the story of Anglophone Caribbean nationalism. And he does it best in one of the articles that he published years ago that is included in this book, Afro-Creole Nationalism as Elite Domination, which is an absolute tour de force. It takes us from the early 20th century down to the 1980s. And for me, more than any other single article, actually manages to capture and explain exactly what is happening and why we have found ourselves at the cusp of neoliberal times by the end of the 1980s. So Percy's work here in recounting this story is really unparalleled. The second thing is the convergence in Percy's work between theories of the Caribbean state and theories of post-colonial Caribbean citizenship in the Anglophone Caribbean. So particularly in the first decade of this century, when I was in graduate school, I was very captivated by a set of persons who were doing some very compelling essays and books trying to theorize the nature of the current malaise in the Anglophone Caribbean state. And I'm thinking about persons like Brian Meeks, Trevor Monroe, Selwyn Ryan, Obika Gray, all of those and the very important work that they were doing. But then simultaneously in this same decade, there was also a set of very compelling work on Caribbean citizenship, and particularly led by Caribbean feminist thinkers who really exposed the heteronormative and predation impulses of the Caribbean state. And here I'm thinking particularly of Tracy Robinson, Jackie Alexander, Udine Barreto, Patricia Muhammad, Rhoda Reddock. And one of the things that Percy represented for me when I really started to dig deep into his work was how much he represented a consolidation of both of those fields of understanding and gave so much to both of those, okay? So he was theorizing citizenship within the Anglophone Caribbean state. He was also theorizing the nature of the state writ large, its international relations, its connection to global political economy. So that's the second point I wish to make. The third and last point I want to make is Hintzen as a theorist of what I call Creole neocolonialism, because Percy is very interested in the means by which the post-colonial elites have not only perpetuated social and economic relations of colonialism, but have also created new neocolonial formations, okay? So they've continued to see this. And I just want to read you one quick passage from his work. This is on page 7 of the book. Percy says the following: once the condition of equality becomes asserted in the post-colonial context, everything associated with post-colonial inequality is rendered irrelevant and subject to different interpretations, irrespective of the objective conditions. What once was exploitation becomes sacrifice. What was domination becomes functional organization. What was privilege becomes reward. What was discrimination becomes strategic allocation. These transformations are explained by the logic of equality embedded in the meaning of nationalism. Presuppositions of post-colonial equality become the force-driving predispositions towards the acceptance of conditions of extreme inequality. And all of this is consolidated by, fashioned, reconfigured by the post-colonial elites in order to do what our book title tells us they are doing: reproduce domination. So those are the three things that I wish to put on the table as three of the most lasting contributions I believe Hintzen has made. And I'll turn over to Charisse again for the first question.
So I also want to just remind folks to please drop your questions into the Q&A box so that after we finish our discussion, we can bring you all into the conversation. So first question, Dr. Percy C. Hintzen. In the prologue of Reproducing Domination, you wrote that your work fits into the neo-Marxist tradition. So I wondered if you can say a little bit more about what you mean by that. And also, who are some of your interlocutors and what scholarly or political conversations are you intervening in with your work at the intersection of elite domination of the Caribbean post-colonial state, Creole identity formation, and circuits of international capitalism?
You're muted, Percy.
Okay. I repeat. Interesting and very, very important question, Charisse. But before I respond, I'd like to thank Aaron and yourself, because this project is yours. As all of my projects, they belong to my students. I listen to my students and I reproduce what they say in a comprehensive way. So thank you. And I think it's important that this book is co-edited and to a certain extent co-authored. It's the question. Well, the other thing I'd like to say is to thank ASWAD and Lori and James, for doing this very, very important series and for having me and others to sort of carry on the tradition of what I call African intellectual tradition for a particular reason. Now, in terms of my the designation as a neo-Marxist, and it's a sort of a misnomer because it's actually the early Marxists as opposed to the late Marxists. The Marx and Engels work. I find and I critique in very many ways, primarily because it inherits the historicism that is also at the root of developmentalist discourse. And it privileges the working class, the European working class, in a way that I think poses a lot of problems to our project, and our project being the project of the majority of the world's population, most of whom, almost all of whom, with the exception of a few, have been colonized, by Europe and Southern Europe initially and Western Europe, and understandings have been sort of imposed on us. So I tend to look at the scholarship of coming out of that tradition, very skeptically, even though I think the structuration of Marx, leaving out the historicism of Hegel, for example, and also the racism of Kant, is very, very important. And I think that is very, one of the lessons that I'd like to, I'd like to tell my students is that you just can't look at something and say it's either bad or good. You can't. They're kernels of ideas and truths in the most vicious, coming from the most vicious and oppressive sources. And what one has to do is to attempt to reflect on your own condition, the material conditions of your life, and to ask yourself whether it makes sense to you and why it does or it doesn't, on how useful or not useful and how it explains your condition. I would say, which would come as a surprise to a lot of persons, that the two most important at this point in time, when I begin to reflect on it, the two most important thinkers that influence my own particular desire for a future of a future of becoming human, are Mao Zedong and Gandhi. For a number of reasons. I think Mao Zedong was the person who challenged, European historicist, developmentalist Marxism, of which Marx was very much a center of, inherited from Hegel, and then and all the racial and racist implications of Kant. And I think that he challenged it, and the challenge was very, very important, because he pointed out that if the European working class that turned out to have entered into what Samir Amin, who's another scholar who's influenced me, calls a social democratic alliance, where they say, I'm willing to join with the capitalists, if they transfer some of the wealth to me and make me into a nice middle-class person, I'm willing to go with them. And the only way they could have done that was to engage in the super exploitation of the global South. The super exploitation of the global South. Even though a lot of the ideas that informed anti-colonial and decolonial theses and theories and engagements came from them. And even though, to a certain extent, given the fact that they were in positions of influence, they were the ones who began to push anti-colonial practice to a certain extent. However, as we see in Europe today, they have sold out in the same way that the global, the post-colonial middle strata have sold out. And that has also been one aspect of my own critique. Why Gandhi? Because I believe that what Gandhi did, irrespective of the criticisms of him, was to go back to the fundamentals of the human condition. And the fundamentals of the human condition rests with small, rural, self-sufficient communities that are, whose systems of governance allows the participation of everyone. And I would not have mentioned either Mao or Gandhi 10 years ago. But I'm mentioning them now because I do believe that there's a sort of a kernel. Of course, Mao abandoned it after a while because of the influence of Russia. There's a particular kernel of what they call the cooperative and the Swadeshi, where equality can only be realized and achieved, and governing that is good as opposed to good governance. Good governance meaning you're managing the technologies and techniques of dominating people. But government that is good means that you are catering to the fundamental needs of their humanity. And the only way you could do that is by finding out what their humanity is. And you can't be in London or New York and find out the humanity of a Dinka in southern Sudan. And particularly given the history of racialization upon which this project that is destroying everybody rests. So I think that for Gandhi, the Swadeshi and which we're beginning to see among a lot of Indian scholars, and which we also saw, in Tanzania. What happened in Tanzania was an attempt to reproduce that on the Nyerere. That's a really pure form of African socialism. So Nyerere becomes very, very important. The problem is, and this is where we get into the state, that once you have an administrative centralized state, you have no option but to give that up. And that is what happened in Tanzania, which I felt was somewhat of a hope after the Chinese went their way. and the Indians went their way. The India, once the Congress Party took over, then that was the end of whatever it was that Gandhi wanted. And once the Communist Party became what it was, in China, that was the end of that. China is now the biggest capitalist entity in the world,
Yeah, Percy, on that, I actually want to ask you a question that attempts to, or I'll just put it this way, cost of regime survival was an incredibly important comparative study of Trinidad and Guyana. And I was wondering if you could trace for us the pathway between the cost of regime survival and what you were doing there, and that series of essays that mostly constitutes Reproducing Domination, including the title essay, Reproducing Domination from Social Identities, 1996. In other words, what were the kind of intellectual influences and that took you from where you were in cost of regime survival towards Reproducing Domination? I mean, to give one example, I know that Bourdieu becomes very important in your work during that period of time, but I was wondering if you could talk us through there and the influence of being at Berkeley, African diaspora studies as a field of investigation, and what that meant to you over that period of time.
Yeah, let me be, I'll try to be as quick as possible. Yeah, as I said before, my work, and this is Gramsci. Gramsci is also very, very important to my study. And a lot of persons look at Gramsci's hegemony and his work on hegemony. But I think his work on ideology is very, very important, because what he's saying is that ideology emerges from the material conditions of one's life. And since different people have different material conditions, you don't have this Marxist binary. You don't have that binary. And it seems as though, all these groupings are trying within the framework of the centralized state to somehow become a dominant group, et cetera, et cetera. So, one of the things that became important to me was that my reality coming from Guyana, and a lot of people don't know Guyana, right? In Guyana, the two biggest groups are the groups from South Asia and groups from Africa. And then the dominant group are white people. Now, it so happened that my mother is Indian, is South Asian, and my father is half white. You see? And my father comes from a plantation-owning family, and whose father's predispositions were quite racist. Notwithstanding the fact that he married a Black woman. And my father sort of inherited some of that, notwithstanding the fact that he was half Black. And my mother was extraordinarily poor from and so on. So when people spoke about race in Guyana, it didn't make any sense to me. So my intervention in race, came from a very critical perspective. It came from a very, very critical perspective. And I began to understand, motivations and sentiments that are infused with race that have absolutely nothing to do with the reality of the conditions. I see it as a structural thing. Then I grew up under colonialism. I grew up in the throes of the anti-colonial battle in Guyana and in Barbados, for whatever that is worth, because Barbados was a fundamentally different, it was constituted fundamentally differently from Guyana, you see, and fundamentally differently from the rest of the Caribbean, with the possible exception of Grenada. You know, possible exception, with the exception of Grenada. So, you know, and when I was going to high school, I was in Barbados, and the Barbadian structure produced understandings that led to a very conservative orientation, a very colonialist orientation to the project, even though there were certain liberal tendencies there, you know, on the Barrow, for example, you know, it was and it sort of reflected, the tendency of the Gramscian, as opposed to Guyana, which was raising Cain since 1902 against colonialism with Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow. And in the 1920s, Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow was going to Russia, you see, to figure out what's going on. And then you had people like Martin Carter and a whole bunch of radicals in Guyana. So when I went to England, you see, I mean, I had to figure all of this out. And when I went to England, I was very conservative, very conservative. And in England, I got faced, you know, coming from a middle class, upper class, you know, I got faced with the fact that I was a nigger. You know what I mean? I ran right into this notion, this campaign of keep Britain white, keep Britain white. And they were beating us all of that. And then Ewart Thomas, whom you don't know, whom you may not know, but Walter Rodney, they were the guys who were trying to protect us from this KBW thing. And the problem was that I put my class position here. I'm going to a freaking university, and these poor ass white people are telling me that they're better than me. You know, I couldn't understand it. And it was the 1960s. And there was this massive challenge to capitalism, you know, in the United States, in Canada, anti-Vietnam War, all of the, you know, everything was sort of coming together in Africa, in Asia, everything was coming together, you know, and capitalism was about to end. See, it was about to end. Everybody said, fine, you know, capitalism's done. And it didn't. And I decided I'm going to go back to Guyana, this radical space. And then going back to this radical space, I was confronted with a polarized situation where two groups were all radicalized, but they were fighting against each other because you know, they want control of what is known as the state, the governing authority. And when I was writing my dissertation, which became the book, I did research, I came to the conclusion it didn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what the ideology of the ruling group is. That if you're in the global south, you're going to be messed over, you know, for the most part. The lower strata is going to get screwed no matter what. And the two outcomes, Trinidad was very capitalist, so to speak, ideologically. And Guyana was very Marxist ideologically, or so they claimed. But the vast majority of people were, as we say, catching hell. So I felt that there's a structure. You can't talk about it as though, you know, this leader and that leader and these people and those people and et cetera, et cetera. They're captured in a structural order. And this structural order has material consequences, has material implications. And it is these material implications that explain how they view the world, however problematic that is. And I think that that became very much part and parcel of my own particular understanding.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So we have two questions in the Q&A box. I'm just going to ask them both. If you could respond thoroughly but succinctly,
Thank you.
we would be much obliged. You got about 13 minutes. All right, so I'll ask both of them and you can kind of respond to one and then the other or each together or however you want. So the first one is, when you get a moment, can you talk about the significance of the Caribbean in particular to the way we tell a history of political economy? What do we lose by not having the Caribbean political economists at our fingertips in Black studies? What do we gain by thinking with scholars like Professor Hintzen, so like yourself? Second question, how does this post-colonial state referenced interplay with the current geopolitical reordering where we now see former colonial powers re-upping neo-colonial practices across the global South in great power competition? So those are the two questions. Please respond thoroughly but succinctly to one or the other or both. Thank you.
Okay. What was the first question?
Okay, the first question has to do with what do we learn from Caribbean political?
Okay, yeah, listen, this is very, very important. And I'm going to tell you why. You know, there are a lot of people who speak about small states and small people and unimportant people. The Caribbean is where the modern world was formed, was fashioned, was organized, and where it works itself out up to today. And that is a fact. Now, the fact that it is marginalized, you know, hides the fundamental conditions of coloniality, of dispossession, and you know, possibilities, etc., etc. But it also tells you the story that no matter how modernity is represented in the global South, it is always a failed project. It is of necessity. So I speak about the axial division of labor. That's a structural order. Because what the Caribbean represents is, you know, the place of super exploitation that allows people like Elon Musk, you know, to have a net worth of $200 billion. And dependent upon minerals and people and organizational forms that are predominantly located in the global South. That what I call the axial division of labor, the division of labor along the axis of the North versus the South. So without understanding, and the Caribbean is also the place where resistances occur, but these resistances are suppressed by the Westphalian state and by state authority that abducts people and conscripts them as governing elite to participate in the system that is ultimately destroying the conditions of subsistence in the world. And I think and West Indian scholars have always said this until they got co-opted by this neoliberalism thing, you know. But they understand because they live those realities. Everything, all of the forces and histories and flows and realities of the entire globe came together in the Caribbean, continue to circulate throughout the world through the Caribbean. And so the persons in the Caribbean are highly placed to understand and to resist and reject or join with or what have you, these global currents. So it is the center of the global current. The next question is post-colonial.
So the next question is, how does this post-colonial state reference interplay with the current geopolitical reordering, where we see former colonial powers re-upping neo-colonial practices across the global South in great power competition?
Well, see, here's the problem. There is a way in which, once globalization emerged, primarily because of the development of these new technologies, communication technology, transportation technology, computer technology, all these other technologies, which then made it possible for production and reproduction to be concentrated among the majority of the world's population, which happens to be not European in whatever way, right? But in order to do that, it had to build on what I call the National Development Project. Now, the National Development Project was where the middle and upper strata in the global South became complicit and participant in the global capitalist project, and were able to extract and appropriate surpluses, and ultimately in this current phase, to transform what we might call international capital, where capital and all the flows related to capital, people, things, etc., flowed between what we might call national entities. It became a totality, a transnational entity in which these persons have become ensconced. And they have become very much part and parcel of not merely the governing elite, but the ruling elite. They're the ones who are, I could sort of name a lot of them. We could name Butch Stewart. Well, he's dead now, but his son, these guys are not, when you say Butch Stewart is Jamaica, you got to be great. He's a global, international capitalist. So I'm sorry, a lot of people may not know who Butch Stewart is. He's dead now, but he formed what's the name of the chain?
Sandals.
Yeah, Sandals. He's the Sandals guy. Okay. You see, so it has transformed global relations into transnational relations. And as a result of that, the governing elite no longer have a vested interest in ensuring the sustenance and conditions of life of the rest of the population. And the rest of the population have become so dispossessed that they are forced into dehumanizing conditions and dehumanizing engagement, including selling themselves and selling their children, and et cetera, if they want to survive. They are forced into what we might call survival strategies of bare life, only to maintain their life conditions. And that is the state of the world today. And I think we go all the way back to Marx, because Marx predicted this. Marx says that at a certain point, the system becomes incompatible. It's a negation. And the system is going to negate the negation, because if you have a whole bunch of people who are immiserated globally, and the system is a globalized system, it cannot sustain itself. At the same time, it has become commodified. So you don't have the reproduction is commodified, right? So in order to get the conditions of reproduction, meaning sustaining the life conditions of people, you have to pay for them. And with the commodification, it destroys the fundamental environment, because if everything goes into the market, the profit motive, surplus motive, and it
Yeah.
So we're beginning to see that crisis, the crisis of unsustainability, both on the human side and on the environmental side.
Yeah. Percy, I know that we're getting close to time, but I wanted to ask you quickly. I know you've done a series of articles in Starbrook News recently on Guyana and the nature of contemporary Guyanese society. I just wanted to see whether you wanted to make a comment on that as a leading scholar of Guyana and Guyana's political economy, on where Guyana is. Noting though that we probably only have about 2 or 3 minutes before we go towards wrap up.
Okay, well, yeah, Guyana is I don't know. Guyana, there's just a phenomenally recent find of oil in Guyana, crude. And if that crude is released and used, the devastation to the environment would be phenomenal. That's number one. Number two, Guyana is located in the Amazon basin and the Guyana Shield. That is the last hope for humanity, because it's the lungs, it's the carbon sink, it's everything. And this is the dilemma we face. You see, are we gonna go to destruction through the use of fossil fuel, or are we going to revert back to conditions where the fundamental conditions of sustenance and human lives and human beings are going to be preserved? And this is the dilemma that we face in Guyana. The other thing is that Guyana is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. And Guyana was one of the major producers of sugar when sugar was king. It was one of the major producers of bauxite when bauxite was king. It is a major producer of gold, not the major producer. And now it's going to be one of the major producers of oil. None of it has ever brought Guyana any benefit, any development in terms of the human condition, sustenance, and sustainability. We're heading down the road of colonialism, and intense colonialism, and I think that, everyone needs to look at what's going on in that country, and hopefully everyone needs to push back against Exxon and the Guyana government and the American government and the other governments who seem to think that Guyana is the salvation. Well, it is, but it's in the wrong direction. And God help us if there's a spill. These oil fields are over 100 miles at sea. If there's an oil spill there, Guyana is also off the major fishing banks in the world. Major. And, God help us. So I think that rather than looking at Guyana economically, we should look at Guyana in terms of whether or not we're going to be moving towards a future of humanity, or we're going to go the way of the dinosaurs. And it's a small country. It has 700,000 people in the world. And people say, oh, it's just a little teeny-weeny country. Well, that's not true. Teeny-weeny means small. Sorry.
End us on a hopeful note. So what is the next step? So the world's eyes are now on Guyana. You put us up on game about Guyana. What is the next step? You got 1 minute. What is the next step? How do we save humanity?
We save humanity by using the environmental mobilization, the environmental forces, the forces of the environment, the forces of indigeneity, the forces of the rural subsistence producer, and the wisdom that comes with all of that to massively mobilize against the World Economic Forum, Trilateral Commission, the craziness that's going on in the United States, and the craziness is going on in Asia as well. Because I think Asia has taken a little wrong step. And I think we have to look to Africa. I'm going to say something. There's a book by Dio Olopade, and it's called The Bright Continent. And I think everybody should read that book to see how to survive this crisis.
So I want to step in here and say thank you so much to our speakers today, Professor Percy Hintzen, Professor Charisse Burden-Stelly, Professor Aaron Kamugisha. Again, the book is Reproducing Domination on the Caribbean Post-Colonial State. If you don't have it, please pick it up. Our next book talk is on Monday, March 20th at 3 p.m. with Professor Yuko Miki interviewing Professor Olufemi Taiwo on elite capture, how the elite took over identity politics and everything else, which I think will be an interesting way of continuing some of the conversation that started here. And then the last in our series will be on Monday, April 17th at 3 p.m. on a new book by Professor Joanne Villalobos Flores, The Silver Women, How Black Women's Labor Made the Panama Canal. So thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Thank you again, Professor Percy Hintzen, for your work, and for Professor Kamugisha and Professor Burden-Stelly for bringing it together for us in this edited collection. I'll just note that the last book that Professor Hintzen mentioned is The Bright Continent, and Charisse has put it in the chat for those of you who are interested. Thank you again on behalf of ASWAD, and enjoy your afternoon, everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Buy the book.